Hello and welcome to Heartlight Vedic Astrology. In today's talk, I was going to go through symbolism of Rahu and Ketu, also known as the north and south nodes of the moon, respectively. And this is all from a Vedic astrology or Jyotish perspective. So, note beforehand the information presented here is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical, financial, professional, or life advice of any kind. If you are in need, please contact an appropriate professional for support. I have a bunch of Jyotish Vedic astrology teaching videos. You can find all of them in my concepts playlist if you're interested in learning more about Vedic astrology. For this talk specifically, you might look, I have a whole playlist on the planets, also known as Grahas in Sanskrit. And this is the last of the series because I've done the other ones. So Rahu and Ketu is the last planet symbolism video. But the two, if you're going to look at the planets playlist, I would probably look at Saturn and Mars first, because as you'll see in this talk, Rahu often acts like Saturn and Ketu often acts like Mars. So, and I'll be referencing that. This talk is going to be describing more of the unique properties to Rahu and Ketu, but there is overlap with Saturn and Mars and also between Rahu and Ketu. So, anyway, that's available. The other thing to know is that in all of my videos, if you see a double asterisk, that means that there's a teaching video on the subject, and you can find those in my concepts playlist again. So if I talk about planetary war or I talk about eclipses, and you're like, oh, what does that mean? You can go there and see a video about it. The other thing is that as you go through this talk, I've pulled out some of my photos that are meant to represent Rahu and Ketu and the things that they symbolize. So as you go through this talk, you might look at each photo and ask yourself, how are Rahu and Ketu represented by the image? Yeah. And what this is meant to do is to actually build your intuition and relationship with Rahu and Ketu, because astrology just doesn't happen when we're looking at birth charts. It happens every day. And so if you kind of open your eyes and your awareness to, everything has planetary energy. Is this tree more Mercury or Saturn or Rahu or Ketu? Is this food more Mercury or Saturn or Rahu, Ketu? So the more that you start to identify these different planetary energies just walking around in your life, the more it'll bring to your interpretation of birth charts if that's what you're intending to do. Alrighty. So Rahu and Ketu, again, the north and south node of the moon, respectively. And as I briefly mentioned, Rahu often is similar in its properties and symbolism as Saturn, and Ketu is often similar to Mars. So again, you probably want to look up those videos and remind yourself of Saturn and Mars. Um, the days that are represented by these planets, Rahu is represented by Saturday, and Ketu is represented by Tuesday. So again, Saturday is also the day of Saturn, and Tuesday is also the day of Mars. So you already see the relationship that's interwoven here between Rahu and Ketu. The other thing I should mention is that if you're not familiar, Rahu and Ketu aren't actual physical planets. They're called Shaya Grahas, or shadow planets. And actually, they don't have a mass or a density the way other planets do. They're actually a calculation where the orbit of the sun crosses the orbit of the moon. So that symbolism is important because, again, it makes what was pretty consistent with Rahu and Ketu is they symbolize things that are unusual or kind of difficult to grasp. And so again, having a planet that's not an actual planet fits into that. All right, so strength positions for these two. They own or rule, or it's called swa position in Sanskrit when a planet is in its own sign. And this is actually only used, the ownership, rulership, and all that, is only used in the amshas or subzodiacs. It's not used in a birth chart or the natal chart. But in the subzodiacs or amshas, Rahu owns Aquarius or Kumbh, and Ketu owns or rules Aries or Mesha. Okay, so exalted position, these two are exalted in the constellation or Rashi of Scorpio, also known as Vrishika in Sanskrit. And they both have directional strength or Digbala. And this directional strength is only used in the Amshas or subzodiacs again, like the ownership, rulership. And again, Rahu is like Saturn. It's got Digbala in the seventh house or seventh bhava, which represents the western direction. Also about 6 o'clock in the evening if we're looking at time. And K2 has Digbala like Mars in the 10th house or 10th bhava, and the 10th house represents the southern direction as well as 12 p.m. or noon, so high noon. Okay. Weakness positions. Rahu and Ketu are debilitated or Nicca in Taurus or Vrishabha. And they're also weak when they're Sandhi, which means the first or last degree of any sign, which is true for all planets. The other thing to know is, I mean, they don't participate in planetary war. They don't go combust. They're always retrograde. So again, Rahu and Ketu are the exceptions. But what's the thing about Rahu and Ketu is they actually cause weakness to planets, especially through eclipses. So that's important to know. Relationships, these are similar to Saturn and Mars. So Rahu like Saturn, but Ketu like Mars. The thing though is that these Rahu Ketu relationships, like, what are the relationships with other planets? Not all Jyotishis use this. I don't use this. Um, but some Jyotishis do. So I just put it out there so you're aware of it. Qualities of Rahu and Ketu. I started briefly describing Rahu and Ketu. So Rahu and Ketu represent things that are hidden, unusual, foreign. That's pretty consistent with Rahu and Ketu. Also, like they have a quality of kind of temperament of being eccentric or explosive. Explosive being more K2, eccentric being both, but maybe a little bit more Rahu. And then Rahu, like Saturn, is very Vata-like or contains a lot of the air element, especially when you're looking at health or medical things, because this part, the doshas, Vata, Pitta, Kapha, this comes from Ayurveda or traditional Indian medicine. So if you're looking at these charts and integrating Ayurveda, Rahu represents Vata, or the air element, and Ketu represents Pitta, or the fire element. Um, both of these are considered tamasic planets or destructive planets. Rather than building things up like Jupiter or Venus, they tend to break things down. Uh, Rahu, if we're looking at gender, Rahu is more of a feminine energy and Ketu is more of a neuter energy. And again, this doesn't come down to biological or kind of natal sex. It's more gender. So we tend to use this, for example, if we're looking at children and trying to identify potential sex of children and stuff like that. But I have found that sometimes these relate more to the energy of somebody rather than the physical body of somebody. So even though a person might be a female in terms of biology, their energy might be quite male. Like if they have a lot of male planets like Saturn and Mars and not Saturn, but Mars and Sun and Jupiter. Those are all male, considered male energy planets. And both of these are considered natural malefics. So that's also important. That kind of goes along with the destructive, domestic quality of Rahu and Ketu. So personification. So if, for example, the sun represents the king and moon represents the queen, Rahu and Ketu represent the masses. So you'll see this fits in with other things here. But again, who when we think of Rahu and Ketu, who would come to mind? So people who are misfits, people who don't easily fit into conventional social categories, people who are a bit odd or unexpected or things that are such. quirky, oddball. These are the sorts of terms like when you meet somebody, you're like, oh, they're kind of an odd person or unusual person, or they have these like strange hobbies or something like that. That's Rahu and Ketu playing out. Foreigners, because again, this sort of idea of misfits or being outside of the norm convention, and that can be a positive thing or negative thing, depending again on the condition of these planets and what they're associated with, other planets they're associated with, and which houses they're in. So again, this is can be kind of a higher octave of Rahu and Ketu or a lower octave. Shady people, a little bit, don't quite know what they're doing. They may not have the best of intentions. That could be Rahu Ketu. Spiritual, people, outsiders, and this is similar to foreigners, but this is more specific to the classic, Indian caste system. And caste, by the caste system, I'm not necessarily meaning like this group of people was better or worse than this group of people, the other group of people. But in the caste system was originally designed, um, or kind of organized to identify people who have a similar mindset. And again, it's not about better or worse. It's just, different mindsets. So there's some classes, some caste systems where they're the merchant class, and these are people who just tend to think about businesses and money and marketplace, type stuff. And there are other castes, like the Brahmin class, who are more interested in like, education and teaching. That's just how their mind tends to work, and that tends to run through families naturally. But it's not necessarily, this whole idea of like discriminating against people based on these things is not, what I advocate, and that's actually not in the classical literature from which caste system derived. Um, Also, for Rahu and Ketu, like if they're in the Lugna, the first house ascendant, rising sign, those are all different names for the same thing. Somebody might be particularly tall or short. So again, it's going to stand out. By their stature, they're going to stand out. Clothes that they might wear, multicolored, patched, torn, dirty, dark checks, plaid. These sorts of things indicate kind of a Rahu Ketu energy for clothing. If we're looking at partners, like if we were doing assessment of, marriage partner or marriage-like partner, when we see Rahu and Ketu involved in partner assessment, we tend to think of people who are partners who are widowed, divorced, foreign, sickly, and quote unquote very different. So what does that mean? So there's this category of assessment with, relationships where there's this, especially when you're looking at marriage or marriage-like relationships, there's this category of being a mixed marriage. Now, what does a mixed marriage mean? A mixed marriage means two people come together who are quite different. And it could be socioeconomic differences, it could be race, it could be class, it could be ethnicity, it could be place of origin, it could be culture, it could be, skin color, um, it could be, financial status, it could be health status. Because again, typically in the classical use of Jyotish and the kind of classical, values of, uh, finding a spouse and getting married and having a family, um, traditional Indian culture was all about, conventionality and tradition and maintaining, the family line. And so if somebody was too different, then that would, usually cause problems, in terms of keeping the same, uh, line of thought and tradition and culture even within a family. And also, like on the street, if you see couples who are obviously physically different from each other, that would catch stares and cause, gossip and stuff like that. I mean, still to this day, that happens, right? More so in more traditional cultures. And so that's where this idea of very different. This could even be like a LGBT, QIA, like gay, lesbian, transgender type, or, uh, non-binary relationships and stuff like, things that are just a bit out of norm. Not good or bad, just a bit different. Yeah. Um, Also, if we're looking at personification, Rahu represents maternal grandparents. and other similar people. The people that Rahu represents are similar to Saturn. So again, you might look up that Saturn video. And Ketu represents paternal grandparents and also people who are similar to the Mars planetary energy. The psychology of Rahu and Ketu, so they are, between the two, are a little bit different. Um, so Rahu is more about like being original, individual, independent, insightful, ingenuous, inspiring, imaginative, driven, and ambitious. Kind of like I know people have talked about New York being very Capricorn in energy. I don't really see New York City as like being Capricorn in energy. I mean, Capricorn's a very practical planet. It's a very high achieving planet, but I think New York is more Rahuvian than Capricorn. I mean, because you go to New York for what? I mean, for big dreams, right? I mean, you're like looking to be an actress or looking to be a millionaire on Wall Street or, I mean, New York City is not generally the place you go to if you want the, you know, family, two kids, dog, and a white picket fence. I mean, that's a little bit more kind of conservative, traditional Capricorn energy. I mean, New York is, if you've ever just even walked around, I mean, you can see by the dress and the fashion and stuff like that. I mean, it's a lot more eccentric and out there, and um, it actually changed. I think it changed a bit since the pandemic, but the pandemic changed a lot of things in the world. But I mean, it's all about ambition and drive. It's not about doing things small in New York. So I don't know. I challenge that, idea that New York is a Capricorn type place. I think it's more Rahuvian. Um, and K2, and again, right now we're talking about the more positive aspects of the psychology involved with Rahu and K2. So K2 can be like impressionable, idealistic, intuitive, compassionate, spiritual, self-sacrificing, subtle, detached, separatist, where it's like you're more of a doing your own thing, not quite in your own little bubble. I mean, it can be if it's really extreme, or like maybe if you had K2 in the 12th house of isolation or something like that, then you'd have a planet representing isolation and a house that represents isolation. So that might be somebody who's really has the habit of checking out, or it could be somebody who spends a lot of time in like a isolated place, like a spiritual, like a temple or ashram or something like that. Again, depending on the whole birth chart, you have to look at that. But K2 again is kind of its own, they're their own person doing their own thing, kind of going against the grain a bit, not following the crowd, That's neither people who have heavy Rahu K2 energy in their chart, they're just going to be doing, creating their own path in life. They typically are like pioneers, um, sort of thing. So on the negative side, though, if Rahu and Ketu are imbalanced or a negative condition, Rahu can bring out things like timidity, anxiousness, hallucinations, confusion, escapism. And I mentioned escapism already. Neurosis, psychosis. So you can see there's a lot of mental health stuff. And again, these are the nodes of the moon, and the moon itself represents the mind, the intuitive mind. So you might actually also look up, I didn't flag it as like being a video, but maybe I should have. You probably also want to look at the moon video on the symbolism of the moon to get more of the underlying base energy for Rahu and Ketu, because you'll see there's a lot of mental health stuff that's associated with Rahu and Ketu. Where were we? Deception. It's hiding and the moon, so there's just this general sort of secretive, deceptive vibe with people. Addictions, being vague, just not being very clear, being slippery. Illusion, delusion. All this can be Rahu in a negative state. K2, so Rahu again, but all this is kind of more of a Saturnian Vata type, airy, um, type of energy. K2 again is a bit more like Mars, so it's a bit more fiery. So you can see with K2, when K2's out of balance, you're going to get more anger, irritability, impatience, inconstancy. Someone who's a fanatic or a violent, again, unconventional across the board here, but someone who might also be amoral, like, maybe an anarchist, or iconoclast or impulsive. These are the these are the energies psychologically of Rahu and Ketu when they're more imbalanced or better balanced versus when they're in a negative state, and the difference between the two. So professions, Rahu is again like Saturn, Ketu is again like Mars, but Rahu starts to bring in this like notion of the occult and psychic knowledge, and Ketu brings in the energy of spiritual knowledge. So again, it's sort of, the base of Saturn, Mars, but you know, with this additional layer. Okay, so professions, juggling, magician, illusion, circus, disguises, like actors, movies, film, photography, because it's a bit of an illusion, right? I mean, you can point your camera in this direction or that direction and put a wig on somebody and you create a whole story and like you create a whole nother world. Um, Immigration, foreign lands, that goes with what I was mentioning. So poisons, alcohol, distilled drugs. So that's getting more into some of the medical stuff, which we're going to get into more, I think, on the next slide or two. But also, uh, and also the alcohol, distillers, drugs. So again, those are all sorts of like things that affect, especially the nervous system. Yeah, and on their own, depending on what drugs, alcohol, drugs, poisons. I mean, these can all shut down the nervous system essentially. Gambling, because again, you don't really know, right? There's risk involved. It's not a sure thing. Um, there's a hidden aspect. Also, gambling can be addictive in a way. Anesthetist, chemist, so that's kind of more with the chemistry and poisons and that sort of thing aspect of Rahu Ketu. Alternative health, because again, if somebody's like a doctor or nurse or something like that, Rahu and Ketu, if Rahu and Ketu are related to their career profession, they're not gonna be a conventional practitioner. They might be an acupuncturist, or they might be a hypnotherapist, or especially hypnotherapy. I mean, that's like, again, the mind and usually phobias and, deep-seated, things in the mind are trying to clear out. Plus, the process itself is very Rahuvian and Ketu. Just heterodoxy in general. So anything that's just, out of the norm. The masses I mentioned already. See, I mentioned already conspiracies, the underworld, spies, assassins. So people who hide their profession. I mean, people who aren't like carrying a card around saying, "Oh, hey, hire me." Yeah, people are involved in illicit activities or criminal activities, forgeries. So again, they're hiding their profession because they're maybe amoral or at least unconventional, or again, not following the social norms. And again, it doesn't always have to be bad, as you see in some of these other things, but can be things that are incomprehensible, things that are difficult to comprehend. That can be Rahu and Ketu. Hidden things again, fraud, theft, unusual. People who are inventors, so people who have a really extensive imagination. Because again, you're sort of drawing inspiration from out of the ethers. You're not basing it on like whereas a scientist is usually building it upon previous, like they develop a theory and then they test the theory, and they might be developing the theory based on what other people have done, and it's this whole sort of slow building thing. Whereas inventors just like they get some sudden flash of insight and they develop like the light bulb or something like that, right? Um, Metaphysician. So again, we're getting into more of the physical, psychic, and spiritual aspects of these planets. Occult, anything related to the occult. Things like Jyotish, Ayurveda, yoga. Those are all Rahu Ketu type things. Psychic, any sort of profession involving psychic ability, enlightenment, especially with Ketu, because again, Ketu is more of a spiritual energy. Anything related to insects or reptiles, because those are animals represented by Rahu and Ketu. Oil and petroleum, because again, that's hidden, and also there's speculation, right? You don't know if you're gonna strike an oil well, or if you're digging in the earth, you don't know if you're actually gonna find any to make a profit. Anything unexpected or sudden. Also things like X-rays, radiation, things you can't see, because again, Rahu and Ketu are invisible or hidden. And labors, so physical labors. So maladies, health, medicine. So Rahu represents the hands, Ketu represents the legs, and as you can see from this list, we've got things like epidemics, so the masses, right? Medical issues for the masses, hysteria, insanity. So here's all the mental, emotional health stuff, addictions, confusion, illusion, delusion, nervous breakdowns, phobias, psychosomatic illness, and then we get into intuition, ESP. And then just more of the physical nervous system, so epilepsy, convulsions, paralysis, palpitations, hypertension. So when the nervous system starts to affect the cardiac system, also persistent skin diseases, unusual growth, so things like cancers, tumors, poisoning. We mentioned the chemistry before. Insect bites, snake bites, especially with K2, because again, K2 has more of an energy of accidents, like Mars does actually. Um, but you get these poisonous animals, insects and snakes, who inject their venom into you, and it causes inflammation, if not death, depending on how much you get and how virulent the poison is. Rare and unusual disease. So you see the flow here, you see the vibe of Rahu and Ketu, and diseases that are difficult to either detect and or treat. So again, hidden, unexpected, unusual. So there's not going to be like a, oh, if you just do XYZ, ABC, XYZ, we can heal you. Like that's a clear cut, easy fix. It's just like, we don't really know what this is. We're trying to find it. And then even when you find it, we're like, we don't know what to do about it. We're trying things out. Like experimental drugs or, clinical drug trials and stuff like that would be like a Rahu Ketu type thing. Places. So, places, both of them actually are similar to Saturn. And I listed here Saturn since they're the same. So Saturnian places are dirty, neglected, abandoned, lonely. Slums, gutters, sewers, garbage, subterranean, basements, cellars. So again, these some of the first part here, these tend to be the more negative, uh, or kind of like dilapidated type of places that Saturn, Rahu, Ketu represent. But also things like mines and graves. So again, things that are you can't see, they're underground, inaccessible. So again, it's not the path of, it's not the clear worn path here. Hermitage retreats, so places of isolation, spirituality, prisons, hospitals, hospice, homeless shelters, ancient ruins. So, one difference though is that Rahu represents buildings made out of stone, and Ketu represents buildings made out of mud or bricks. So, then if we look at flowers, foods, trees, animals, trees and flowers, Rahu like Saturn, Ketu like Mars. Foods, Rahu like Saturn, Ketu like Mars, and both of them actually represent offensive junk food, foreign food. Um, Animals, we sort of mentioned this. So insects, reptiles, rodents, so creatures that creep and swim, also aqueous creatures. So again, these are going to be like creatures that are little, they cause even, a lot of people are afraid of bugs and snakes and stuff like that. You know, um, and they tend to be hidden. They kind of come out of nowhere sometimes. um, or even like aqueous creatures, right? I mean, they have a whole different way of surviving and living in a different environment than we do on if we live on land and we're air breathers, as opposed to like getting our oxygen through oxygen in the water. So you have a whole different system of survival. Rahu specifically is also symbolic for inorganic matter or mineral. So if we're talking animal, vegetable, mineral, Rahu represents minerals. So inorganic or inert substances. So time, distance, direction. The maturation time for Rahu and Ketu is both 48 years old. Personification, they both represent very old people, like 100 years old. The duration, if there's a duration you're looking at, again, we're looking at fairly long duration, 69 to 108 years. They don't represent or symbolize a season. Length, Rahu is longer. It's 20 yojnas. A yojna is 48 miles, so 20 yojnas is going to be 80 to 160 miles. It's quite a bit. Ketu is 7 yojnas, which is going to be 28 to 56 miles, so about maybe a third or so of Rahu. And they both are represented or symbolize the direction of southwest. So shape, color, gemstone, and again, I have an asterisk here as just a cautionary note. I do include a little bit of gemstone information here, but I was advised by my instructors in Jyotish not to really use gemstones to help ameliorate planetary energies because you can get amplification of planetary energy, whether good or bad. So even though the attempt might be to ameliorate the negative effects, you might also decrease the positive effects. So I don't use these, but I'm listing them. If you decide you do want to use these, then I would definitely find somebody who is an expert on them because to do it right and to do it well, apparently you need to find the proper stone and the proper size with the proper clarity and set the stone on a particular day, chanting mantras, and wear the stone for the first time on a specific day, chanting. There's a whole rigmarole around gemstones. I don't know it, so I can't share it, but if you decide to do it, make sure you do it with the right person. But shape, so Rahu represents a line. Ketu represents a flag. Colors, Rahu can be symbolized by black or ultraviolet. So again, a color you can't see, hidden. Ketu is represented by dark color. They're still dark, but kind of a little bit lighter, like dark gray or brown or infrared. Rahu is represented by lead. Ketu is represented by lead or steel, if you're looking for a metal. Rahu, the gemstones related to Rahu are hessonite, amethyst, and agate. And for K2, it's chrysoberyl. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Cat's eye and turquoise. So again, a little information there. There you go. Rahu and Ketu. So that wraps up the symbolism of all the planets. We have, well, at least the classic planets that are used in Jyotish. There are modern planets like Uranus and Neptune and Pluto. I don't use those, so I haven't talked about them. Maybe at some point I will, but I have to learn about them first before I talk about them. Um, I guess I find I get plenty of information here, but who knows? Maybe there's some additional magic that happens when you include those planets in analysis, but I got plenty to work with as it is. So, there hasn't been a big drive to go in that direction, but you never know when that might open up. In any case, again, my teaching videos on Vedic astrology are my concepts playlist. If you're interested in a personal reading on Zoom, I do those, I offer those, and you can email heartlightastro@yahoo.com if that's of interest. I also have another YouTube channel called Nature Source Care, and that channel is talks about other Vedic arts such as Ayurveda and yoga, as well as other paradigms of medicine, um, homeopathy and naturopathic medicine. So basically, it's a channel about natural medicines, different paradigms of natural medicines. Okay, so as always, I hope you found this interesting, useful, and supports you in looking at your own chart or other people's charts or listening to people talk about charts like me and other astrologers. And ultimately, that all of this astrology, Jyotish stuff, helps you navigate the energy cycles of your life. All right, so until the next one, take care. Namaste.